Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. My guest today is Tim R Swartz. He's an Emmy Award-winning television producer, videographer, and authored a number of popular books, including The Lost Journals of Nikola Tesla, America's Strange and Supernatural History, and Time Travel, Fact Not Fiction. As a photojournalist, Tim has traveled extensively and investigated paranormal phenomena throughout the world. What I'll be talking with him about is his book, Mimics the Others Among Us. It was written with Casteel and in collaboration with some of the most talented paranormal researchers of our time. Tim R Swartz, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thank you, Stan. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
How, Tim, were you able to bring together so many prestigious individuals in the field of the paranormal and convince them to devote their time and energies to your project, the writing of Mimics the Others Among Us?
Everyone that's in this book, myself included, we all used to write for the late Timothy Green Beckley, who had a publishing company called Global Communications Interlight Publications. I started writing for Tim when he was producing UFO magazines like UFO Universe and Unsolved UFO Reports, things like that. He brought me in to start writing books for his company as well. And not only did I write books for him, but really we were cohorts in crime, so to speak, with his publications. All of the people that are included in Mimic, include especially Casteel, who is just absolutely excellent proofreader as well as a writer, were also authors for Global Communications. They either contributed chapters for books, wrote for his magazines, one way or the other. So after Mr. Beckley passed away a couple of years ago, I wanted to keep that ball rolling, so to speak, that I wanted to continue publishing books along the same lines that Tim Beckley was doing. So when Tim would write books and bring a lot of us in to help write these books, he would usually have 2 to 3, sometimes 4 books at the same time, all in various stages of production. After Tim died, we still had about 3 books that weren't finished. We went ahead and finished those books and then published them on his account with Amazon.com and the help of his relatives. And then we decided that we wanted to write more. So I started a little company called Zontar Press with the hopes of doing the same thing. And everybody that you see in Mimics, we're more than happy to continue this process. Before Mimics, we had another book called Alien Artifacts, which dealt with the investigation and collection of possible bits and pieces of crashed UFOs, things like that. And when we say alien artifacts, it doesn't necessarily mean, little bits of metal, but also physical damage on trees, buildings, even people. But that after we finished that one, it really was very successful. I decided that Mimics, which had always been kind of a fascinating subject to me, would be our next book. Like I said before, everybody just came along and were very enthusiastic to contribute to this book.
What, Tim, triggered your creative juices and led you to come up with the idea of writing about the beings who look human and act human but are not human?
Well, Stan, I've been researching and investigating paranormal phenomena, and that includes UFOs as far as I'm concerned. I was a kid when I started. The first published articles I wrote when I was in college for various UFO magazines, when there were UFO magazines at the time. And all these years, I noticed that one of the chief characteristics of not only UFO reports, but various kinds of paranormal incidents as well, involve beings, entities, whatever you want to call them, that look human, but obviously aren't. And it's always been a question rolling around in the back of my head. Why do they look human? If you go with, say, the UFO hypothesis, that UFOs are extraterrestrial spaceships from other planets. How unlikely is it that some other race in another solar system would develop looking almost practically like us? So then when you come to possible supernatural or paranormal entities, again, why the human shape? You go back through history, through ancient writings, even the Bible. These things went by all kinds of different names: gods, demigods, angels, demons, fairies, the good folk, up until modern times when you have UFO occupants. And they all pretty much retain that humanoid shape. And my question has always been why? And that's the thing that we approach and discuss all the different elements out there on why this is a thing and possible explanations, along with just tons of stories from various people all throughout history. We're not just talking about starting with the, say, like the modern UFO era in 1947. We go all the way back as far as we could possibly go to try to collect these kinds of stories to answer that very question.
As you just stated, the mimics amongst us have been around throughout the ages, been called by different names, such as you said, gods, angels, demons, shapeshifters, extraterrestrials, and you say they do go way back. By any chance, has your research come up with who or what was the earliest mimic encountered by a human?
That's a tough question because you have, say, like some of the very ancient Sumerian or Babylonian writings that they have their creation mythologies, where they talk about human-looking beings that either come from the sky, come from underground, or there was even one, I think it's how it's pronounced, who came from the sea. He was described almost as like being what we would think of as a merman, but he had very human characteristics, and this creature actually taught people the beginnings of civilization, agriculture, mathematics. So I would say that those were some of the earliest mythologies. We also have stories that come from Renaissance and medieval times when you had alchemists who were seeking the Philosopher's Stone, attempting to turn one element into the other, especially lead into gold. And you have these interesting stories with some of these alchemists being approached by men, usually dressed in black cloaks, black hats, who would approach them offering to reveal the secrets of the universe, the secrets of the Philosopher's Stone. And it's obvious that these men probably wouldn't be human as we would characterize ourselves as human. They would appear and disappear mysteriously. They never appeared to age. Situations like that, bringing it up to not really modern times, but then you have the all the stories about people having interactions with the good folk, or we would call them fairies, which, despite what you see on Disney or in fairy books, were never little tiny creatures flying around with gossamer wings on their back. No, most of the time they appeared to be pretty much human. Some of them would be smaller in size than people, but for the most part, if you were to run into one on the street, there could be some characteristics, larger eyes, but for the most part, they would be almost indistinguishable from normal people.
It has been said that mimics have influenced our history and culture in countless ways. Could you, Tim, give some examples of how mimics have influenced man's history and culture?
It's like I said before, probably most of our religion and religious beliefs have come from mimics. And again, when these books and scrolls were originally written, these beings were referred to usually as angels or messengers, but they had, once again, that very characteristic human shape about them. I would say that that is probably one of the most major developments in humankind is our various religious beliefs. Their origins coming from human-looking beings who claim to be messengers from God or other deities. And this also includes like the Greek gods, who were very human looking, and it would often be, said that they walked among us unseen. And the same way with the biblical angels. Some of them were obviously not human looking. The first name that comes to my mind is Abraham, but I don't think that's the one, where he actually challenged the angel to a wrestling match that lasted all night. And if this was some kind of a weird looking creature, not human, I doubt if somebody would challenge them to a wrestling match. And of course, you had the angels that visited Lot just before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And these guys looked so human that the residents of these cities actually were calling them out, wanting them to come out so they could have their way with them. Lot, being the great guy that he was, offered his daughters instead. But once again, if these were things that looked, as I suppose our modern day ideas of something that's paranormal or supernatural, if they look like that rather than normal human beings, I doubt if anybody would say, come on out so we can do things to you. So I would say that religion has been the biggest influence on humanity when it comes to influence by the others.
Do we, Tim, know the origin of mimics? Did they originate on our planet, beneath our planet, from another solar system or dimension? Or is their origin from a source or sources yet to be discovered?
Well, that's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? And we're definitely not going to try to offer any kind of definitive, this is absolutely what's going on explanation, because we just don't know. And we'd have to have a pretty big ego to try to offer a definitive answer to that question. In the book, we approached it from all of these different angles. Also take into consideration the cultural aspects of belief systems when it comes to these beings. Because once again, you go back, say, 1,000 years, and people would interpret these visitations as visitations from gods or angels, right up to modern times where people don't really believe that much in physical manifestations of gods and angels, but the idea that we could be visited by extraterrestrials in our science-based modern technology, well, that doesn't seem as far-fetched. We look at all kinds of different aspects and possible origins and explanations right up to the modern day sightings of wild men like Sasquatch, Bigfoot. Not that we're saying that the mimics are, say, like shaved Bigfoots or something along those lines. We just use that as an example of the possibility that there could be physical human-like beings, cousins, subspecies of humans, that are still alive on this planet, but hiding in the woods, maybe underground civilizations. As like I said, we try to approach this from all sorts of different angles. And then the reader themselves, after reading this, they can judge for themselves.
A tulip materialized being with thought form called the Slender Man went from the digital realm to the real world we live in. Can you, Tim, tell me about that incident?
That's a fascinating account of how possibly people as a group, this is a very Freudian type of idea, that if everyone has almost like a combined belief system, that somehow our consciousness is able to directly affect our reality and create things, make them real. This has been kind of a favorite idea for a long time when it comes to like the ancient gods, especially the very human-looking gods, that as long as there were people thinking about them and believing in them, then they could become real and be real. Some people nowadays are kind of attributing quantum mechanics to this idea that you have a thought process going, then you can make something real. And the Slender Man is a good example. I mean, the Slender Man started out really as just a series of stories on the internet that people were contributing to, and these were fictional stories. But then you started getting reports coming in of people having actual sightings of Slender Man. And it's a process like this kind of builds and builds. And it's almost like there becomes like a direct materialization on our reality when it comes to these things. The late author John Keel wrote about this in similar ways in some of his books, like The Mothman Prophecies and The Eighth Tower. He was saying that the earth or reality is not the only one, that we're surrounded by energies that can be manipulated by the human mind, and that our belief systems really do have the ability to become real themselves. And he would call these creatures ultra-terrestrials, meaning that they weren't extraterrestrials as we would think of them from other planets. They weren't terrestrial from Earth. They were something else. They were like a tulpa. If our listeners aren't familiar with this term, is a being that is basically a creation of the mind. And sometimes these tulpas exist only within the minds of the participants, but they gain a consciousness of their own in the minds of these people. For those who may be a little bit more spiritually advanced, they are able to produce a physical representative of these ideas. But like the Slender Man, if you have enough people thinking along these lines, maybe even believing the reality of these things, then oddly enough, they do achieve a modicum of reality.
As pointed out in your book, mimicry is something common in nature, and it's a fact that there are species who use mimicry to defend themselves in the animal kingdom. Can you give me an example of that?
The insects are really great mimics. It's amazing if you go and look at some of these things, thinking of certain kinds of moths that have patterns that look like faces, eyes and mouths on the back of their wings in order to scare away predators. There are certain walking stick insects that are related to praying mantises. They're called walking sticks for a reason, because they look like thin branches on a tree or bushes. You go up into some of the higher mammals, where you have zebras and tigers who have developed very interesting patterns in their colorations that allow them to blend right in with their environment, so they absolutely can't be seen. Naturally, there are species of birds that will go and actually they can make themselves look like other species in order to blend in, either because that particular species tends not to flock and then they want to blend in with a species that does flock, or you've got the cuckoo bird who will go and actually lay eggs in another bird's nest. Then when these eggs hatch, the baby cuckoos will push out the original eggs after they've hatched or even before they hatch, and the mother birds won't know the difference. They start taking care of an interloper who has come in and killed basically their babies in order to be taken care of. It's interesting to think, why should humans be the only ones that don't have a mimic, that don't have something that tries to look like us to blend in for whatever reason? A lot of the cases that I just presented to you, it's because they either want to prey on something or they don't want to be prey. Again, why would humans be practically one of the only species out there that doesn't have something that either wants to prey on us, which is a frightening thought, or doesn't want to be preyed, and maybe doesn't want to be preyed by us because we are predators. And that's one of the things that we talked about in the book, is that there could have been, or there still could be, other human species that never really went extinct but just hid themselves because we are such a dangerous species. Going back to Bigfoot, or the idea that some of the beings that disguise themselves as extraterrestrials could actually be terrestrial creatures, cousin species to humans, that are using that as a survival mode.
Experiencers, people who claim they had contact with UFOs and extraterrestrials, generally describe them as humanoids, beings that look similar to us, but are definitely not us. Others claim they've encountered ETs that look exactly like us, while others say they encountered reptilian beings. Why all these differences?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? It's what makes this subject so fascinating, is all of these different aspects of the phenomena. The reptilian idea is especially fascinating. You go back into ancient mythologies and you find a number of different encounters with these beings. The serpent in the Bible could probably be interpreted as a reptilian being. Some of the earliest original writings, this serpent was said to have arms and legs. It wasn't a snake. That was something that evolved later on due to mistranslations with the original Babylonian and then Greek translations. With the reptilians, and there's an excellent article, a chapter in our book where the writer and a number of his friends came into association with a guy that was extremely bizarre, and who eventually said that he was a shape-shifting reptilian from another planet. One of these people actually saw him briefly shapeshift, but everybody else who came into association with him, and he went through a lot of people, never saw him change, but he had other bizarre characteristics about him that seemed to show that he wasn't entirely human. And whether or not his story that he was an extraterrestrial was true or not, or just a facade of some kind. And that's one of the things about these things, is that the stories that they tell can't be confirmed and are probably not entirely accurate. That's one of the major aspects of encounters with these beings, is that the stories that they tell probably aren't entirely true for whatever reason. They may have good information, they may be helpful, but as for origin stories, you really have to take them with your tongue firmly implanted in your cheek. As for your original question about why all the different shapes and sizes and stuff, again, that's what makes this subject really interesting, because with the UFO phenomena, especially when people have encounters with the occupants of ships that have landed, I mean, we've got reports of dwarves, tall, skinny people, giants, sometimes small, furry, hair-covered creatures with steel-like claws. It's really amazing when you go and look at all of these different stories. But again, one of the chief defining characteristics with all of these things, despite some of the superficial differences, they all retain that humanoid shape. One head, two arms, two legs, sometimes two eyes, but with the exception of like some of them being really tall or really short or with pointed ears. Once again, there is that human shape, which makes me think that there is some kind of earthly connection. And earthly connection, who knows?
Who knows? My next question to you, you covered part of that about the shape-shifting reptilian, who I was fascinated with, that he gave himself a human named David Daniels, and he visited two
Mhm.
normal humans. That's an incredible story.
It really is a fascinating story, and he was very good at finding other people. He started out in, I think it was Great Britain, and then eventually made his way over to the United States. The late UFO researcher Wendell Stevens, who at the time was in prison, and he disguised himself as a priest and had all the right credentials to allow himself access to Wendell. And it's a really strange case because there never really seemed to be any rhyme or reason on why this guy was doing what he was doing. He didn't ask for money. About the only thing is that he would stay with people for a while, either stay like in an extra room, or in one case he stayed in a trailer that they had on their property. One of the bizarre things is that this trailer, when he was staying there, would heat up. He had a roaring fire or a bunch of space heaters going on while he was in there, but he had none of that. It was like his body temperature was going up to the point that people were physically able to feel the heat coming off of this trailer while he was staying there. And then there was the odd thing where it appeared as if the government was chasing him. The people were getting phone calls from alleged police or government agencies trying to track this guy down. All of that really went nowhere. Then he would move on to another group of people, usually involved in UFO research. And it seemed like that he would try to get information on the next group of people that he would go and visit. But once again, there didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason on why he was doing this. And that's another characteristic with a lot of these types of encounters, is that they will approach a person, do weird things, look bizarre, and then just disappear. Either physically disappear or just go out of their lives again, leaving people to wonder, what was this all about? Because we're brought up to believe in cause and effect, that if somebody is wanting something, they're wanting something for a reason, then that you'll find out what that reason is. Money, sex, whatever. A lot of these visitations involve none of that. It's more along the lines of just leaving an impression on a person's mind that will really remain with them for the rest of their life, and then spread it to the rest of us, and then try to find if there was a rhyme or reason. In the majority of these cases, there never appears to be any reason why it's happening, because we don't live long enough to know this. Maybe there is some kind of very long game being played out that it'll take generations to figure it out. And we're just in the middle of it now.
The stories in Mimic about the phenomenon of the black-eyed boys are certain to send shivers up the spine of anyone who reads them, and will for sure have them thinking twice before they open their doors to any kids who fit the description given of them. Can you relate one of those stories?
The black-eyed kids, see, now there's another good example of like Slender Man, where you had stories that first started coming out on the internet, and we don't know whether or not they were actually true or not, that then seemed to explode into reality, where you had a lot of different other people who had experiences. One of the first case actually involved a man in Texas. He was a newspaper reporter. This is one of the first reported cases. And this was a guy that he had stopped one night outside a movie theater to hit up the ATM for some cash. And when he went back to his car, somebody knocked on his window, and there were a couple of kids dressed in hoodies, and they wanted him to let them in his car to take them home, or to a telephone, or very similar characteristics all throughout these kinds of stories. At first, they kept kind of their heads down, and only one did the talking. but he noticed that they appeared to be somewhat dirty, disheveled, like that they had been spending a lot of time outdoors. But he said that despite their looks, and they were like youngsters, not even yet teenagers, that he got this overwhelming fear inside of him that he was in big trouble, and not trouble like he was going to be robbed. He said that he felt like that he was in the presence of something that was going to kill and eat him. Another interesting point about other mimic cases is that a lot of times people will have this overwhelming feeling of fear when encountering these things. And it was about this point he was almost ready to open the car door and let them in despite his fear, when one of them actually looked up and he saw that their eyes were completely black. Now, this happened in the early 1990s. And even though for like movies and things like that, there were full eye contact lenses being produced to have that all black look, most people would not have been able to access contact lenses like this. But he said as soon as he saw that these kids' eyes were totally black, he rolled up his window and told them to go on their way. And at that point, they were demanding to be let in. And they said, "We can't come in your car unless you let us in." And that is another aspect of the black-eyed kids. If they show up on your door, they ask to be let inside, and will often say, "We can't come in unless you allow us to come in." Verbally tell us that we can come in, which is interesting because it sounds very much like the old vampire stories from as far back as medieval times, when a vampire would appear outside of your window and call your name. And if you were to answer, that would allow it to come inside. But until you answered and acknowledged it, it wouldn't be allowed to come inside. And it's funny because the black-eyed kids seem to elicit that same kind of primal fear in the people who are participating in this game, whatever this game is, to the point where, despite the almost hypnotic effect that these things elicit on the people, once that fear starts to build up, and then once they actually see that these kids don't have normal eyes, "Oh, there's no way you're coming in my house." And sometimes they'll persist banging on the door, demanding to be let inside. There has been some reported cases of people who have let them inside, but I haven't really been able to confirm whether or not those stories are true or not. I'll just leave it to the stories of the people saying that, no, you can't come inside.
When it comes to discussing Men in Black, because of so many movies, TV shows, books, and articles about them, people generally look at Men in Black as humans or government agents, and their mission is to confront, intimidate, and silence folks who claim they had encounters with UFOs and extraterrestrials. You, however, believe that there also exist non-human men in black. What can you tell me about them?
And for those who are watching this, the Men in Black movies are actually latecomers to the whole Men in Black phenomena, because you can go as far back as, at least for the modern accounts of Men in Black, to a man named Albert K. Bender in the early 1950s who lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Bender started one of the first UFO groups called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And he had a lot of members both in the United States and in other countries as well. And Bender claimed that at one point he was visited by 3 men in black who mysteriously appeared in a cloud of mist in his room and demanded that he stop all UFO investigations, and that if he didn't do so, then dire things would happen to him. And Bender basically, he took them at their word for it, and closed down his UFO group, and then moved to California and dropped all UFO activity. He wrote, and I'll put this in quotation marks, he wrote a book called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. But more than likely, it was actually ghost written by a UFO researcher named Gray Barker from Parkersburg, West Virginia. If you read this book, it's very 50-ish science fiction-y. It says that the three men were part of an extraterrestrial group that were visiting Earth and had bases, especially in Antarctica, and that they were here to mine a special type of mineral. And then when they were done, they would go, and that would be end of UFO sighting. But the funny thing is, kind of like the Slender Man and the Black-Eyed Kids and others, soon other reports of people having experiences with the Men in Black started coming in. They come, like the classic mimic characteristics, they come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. You have women in black, or just women. The ones actually wearing dark clothes and coming in triplicate are somewhat rare. Oftentimes it's just one person. Sometimes it's two. Sometimes they show up as disguised, dressed as Air Force personnel. There was one woman who had just really kind of a minor UFO experience and never told anybody about it. And shortly afterwards, she was visited by an Air Force colonel, a United States Air Force colonel, who knew all of her information, knew what she had seen, and wanted to know if she had anything additional to tell him. And she was really puzzled by this because she had kept this sighting to herself. And this was in the days when somebody from the military showed up. You were going to let them in your house and talk to them. At one point, this colonel complained that he had an upset stomach. She had just fixed Jell-O. So she gave him a bowl of Jell-O, saying, well, Jell-O is known to help upset stomachs. He didn't know how to eat it. He tried to drink it from the bowl. Now, as far as I know, most of us know how to eat Jell-O. This guy didn't. There have been other cases where these people will show up on your doorstep. And again, it doesn't have to be UFO related. There were people who were researching the Kennedy assassination that got mysterious visits from people telling them that they had to drop all of their investigations. But some of the characteristics is that these guys will show up unannounced and then disappear. As soon as they go out the door, they're gone. Some of these cases, people lived in kind of, say, like an isolated house down a lane with no other houses around. These guys would show up, do their talking, and then they would go, and then the witness would open the door, and they were already gone. It was like they had stepped out of the doorway and then just vanished in thin air. So you hear that a lot with these types of stories. There was one guy who was visited by a very bizarre individual that he was very tall, which is kind of off the beaten track when it comes to the Men in Black. But this guy was like very tall, very broad-shouldered, and he happened to remark that his friends called him Tiny because he was so big. But he had very white, almost albino type of skin. And at one point, he wiped his lips, and he was wearing gloves. He wiped his lips. The doctor that was the recipient of this visitation noticed that Tiny was wearing lipstick. And he also noticed that when Tiny sat down and crossed his legs, that he had a green wire coming from inside of his shoe and then up his pants leg. He said his pants seemed to be a little bit too short, like high waters. And that when he crossed his legs, his pants kind of rode up a bit, and he noticed this weird green wire going up into his leg. Tiny actually told this doctor that it was his request that he stop all of his UFO investigation. And the doctor said, well, why should I do that? And Tiny asked him to give him some change from his pocket. And this doctor gave him a coin, and Tiny put it in his hand. And the doctor said that the coin slowly dematerialized and disappeared right in front of his eyes. And Tiny said that if we have the ability to make this coin disappear, think what we could do to you or your loved one. And then again, it was another situation where as soon as he stepped outside of this man's house, he was gone. And again, this is a big man. There wouldn't have been any way that he would have been able to run that fast to get that quickly out of sight. So, I mean, that's some of the more bizarre characteristics of some of the Men in Black encounters.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy Mimic, The Others Among Us, or any of your other books, find out about your online newsletter, how can they do that?
I am the co-host on the Paracast with Gene Steinberg, and you can find that on practically every major streaming platform. And its website is www.theparacast.com. Now, as for my books, probably the easiest way would be to go to Amazon.com and type in my name, Tim R Swartz, Swartz, and they'll all come tumbling out for your reading pleasure, both as print and ebooks. Some of them you can find at your favorite local bookstore and library, and I always encourage everyone to please patronize your favorite local bookstore and library.
That's great. Tim R Swartz, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. I very much enjoyed yakking with you.
Thank you very much, Stan. I enjoyed yakking with you as well, and I hope your viewers enjoyed this as well.
I'm sure they will. Thank you. Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.